Good afternoon. My name is Tevi Troy, and I'm a former White House official and former Deputy Secretary of HHS. Around 2012, I got a call from Ken Marcus telling me about this new organization that he was going to start, the Louis D. Brandeis Center, and he asked me if I'd be one of the founding board members. 2012, I wasn't necessarily thinking anti-Semitism was the biggest issue at the time, but I like Ken, and I don't like anti-Semitism, so I decided to join. And boy, am I glad I did, because look what has happened in 12 years. The Louis D. Brandeis Center is an essential resource for addressing the ugly outpouring of anti-Semitism that we have seen since October 7th. They do amazing work. They are an independent, unaffiliated, nonprofit organization established to promote the civil and human rights of the Jewish people and promote justice for all. The LDB engages in research and legal advocacy to combat this terrible resurgence of anti-Semitism on college and university campuses, in the workplace, and elsewhere. They empower students by training them to understand their legal rights and educate administrators and employers on best practices to combat anti-Semitism. Now, this Capitol Hill briefing that you are all at, and thank you all for coming, is meant to be part of a series of learning opportunities for members of Congress and congressional staffers alike, and other people, even if you're not in those categories, to give you the information and the tools you need to help Jewish constituents, Jewish victims of anti-Semitism, and others make informed decisions about public policy. So we're going to hear today from students and parents, actual students and parents who have experienced some of these problems, but we have a panel of Brandeis Center experts here who are going to walk us through this. The first person we have is Rabbi Mark Goldfeder, who I was thrilled to meet for the first time today, but I'm familiar with his work. He's taught law across the U.S. and internationally, and he's the co-author of Religious Organizations in the Law. He's also director of the National Jewish Advocacy Center, and he handles anti-Semitism matters around the country and around the world. Thank you for being here, Mark. Next, we have Deena Margolies. She is a staff attorney at LDB, and she is a graduate of the Northwestern School of Law. And she helps students by using legal tools to address anti-Semitic harassment and discrimination, including filing Title VI complaints with the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights. And she's done it at universities such as American University, Pomona College, where my wife went, Yale University, and the University of Pennsylvania, where my son just graduated, and he is appreciative of your efforts because it's not pretty there. Last, we have Ben Alkon, who is also a staff attorney at the Brandeis Center. He went to George Washington University Law School, and his work focuses mostly on, like Deena, supporting students on campuses by using legal tools to address anti-Semitic harassment and discrimination, including filing those ever-important Title VI complaints with the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights. Now, we keep mentioning this Office of Civil Rights, OCR. Ken Marcus was head of it. He knows a lot about it, and he knows how to use it to make sure we minimize anti-Semitism, and we have tools to go after people who engage in anti-Semitic harassment on college campuses. So Ken Marcus is a great leader for engaging in this effort, and these three people are real experts on the subject, and they're going to walk us through. So first we're going to have Mark talk. Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, actually. Thank you for coming. We're here today to talk about the problem of retaliatory complaints when it comes to anti-Semitism. And so, in order to help us illustrate the problem, we ask you a quick question. You may have heard that while there's been a 300+% increase in anti-Semitic activity, there's also been a 600+% increase in Islamophobic activity. How many of you have seen anti-Israel, anti-Semitic encampments across the country on college campuses? Almost everyone. How many of you have seen an anti-Islam encampment? No one. And the reason is because they don't exist. However, there have been multiple complaints filed about the taking down of these anti-Semitic encampments as acts of Islamophobia. You see, all too often when Jewish people complain about anti-Semitism, anti-Semites pull what's called a classic prejudice pivot. They accuse the very students they have been silencing of trying to silence them. And this perverse victim-blaming tactic doesn't generally happen in other instances involving other forms of discrimination, where the general inclination tends to be to believe the accuser, or to at the very least, to investigate on the assumption that a particular complaint was made in good faith. That's called the McPherson principle. The McPherson principle says that if a person comes to an authority and says they have been victimized, then, quote, authorities and institutions should conduct their investigation on the same initial assumption that the complaint is made in good faith. And yet when it comes to anti-Semitism, the reverse phenomenon happens so often that it actually also has its own academic name. It's called the Livingstone formulation. And the Livingstone formulation says that when people raise the issue of anti-Semitism, they're probably doing it in a bad faith effort, in a dishonest effort to silence legitimate criticism of Israel. And it warns us to be suspicious of Jewish claims to have experienced anti-Semitism. It warns us to begin with the skeptical assumption that those claims are sneaky tricks to gain the upper hand in debates with supporters of Palestine. And this is the substantial basis of many of the retaliatory claims that we are seeing. Again, the Livingstone formulation doesn't allege that the Jews are misjudging what has happened to them. It alleges that they lie about what happened to them, and it's not an allegation of error or overzealousness. It's an allegation that there's a Jewish conspiracy when they complain about anti-Semitism meant to silence others. That conspiracy theory, that is a form of anti-Semitism in and of itself. And we have seen this happen now across the country. From the early days of this conflict, when the University of Pennsylvania faculty were accused of anti-Semitism, they responded with an open letter talking about how those with big fat pocketbooks are trying to buy their silence. A fairly thinly veiled reference to anti-Semitic tropes. Just last week, a video from Emory University leaked in which a member of the Office of Religious Life said that he had gotten CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, to file a lawsuit in order to, quote, neutralize what the Jews were doing on campus. It's an absolutely terrible problem that we're seeing manifest across the board, from administrative complaints to OCR complaints, and possibly heading into federal complaints as well. And it is important that we call it out, and it's important that universities and other authorities know that they do not have to open up these kinds of clearly frivolous retaliatory complaints, and that when Jewish people complain about anti-Semitism, it should be taken seriously in its own right, and is not an act of Islamophobia. And when people try to put these retaliatory complaints in the system, what it does is chill the ability of Jewish students to actually talk about what's happening and their experiences. In order to talk about that and illustrate a little bit more, we're going to hear from a few people who have experienced it firsthand. First, we're going to hear from Sophie Ravina. She's a rising senior at Emory University, majoring in religion and interdisciplinary studies. She's an Emory student ambassador, director of speakers for Emory's TEDx main conference program. She also participated in the Pro-Semitism Fellowship at Emory University and now serves as the vice president for Emory Maor. Sophie's currently a research intern at the Institute of World Politics here in DC, focusing on national security and intelligence, and she'll tell you a little bit about her experiences on campus, including about how her exposing anti-Semitism led to the administration asking her to please not do so anymore.
Thank you all for taking the time to be here today. My name is Sophie Ravina. I'm currently a research intern at the Institute of World Politics, and I'm a rising senior at Emory University in Atlanta. I'm going to begin by reading you some of the messages I have received on social media since October 7th. You are a genocidal Islamophobe. Get out of my school, Zionist B-word. You are the definition of racism. And you hate all Muslims. Go F yourself. I received these messages after I shared a video of 3 girls in hijabs standing by the official Emory sign, which had been spray painted over by members of the Emory SJP encampment to read Emory University of Genocide. Participants of this encampment had also written "Death to Israel" on my school library, and I should mention, misspelled the word Israel. Their words did not say ceasefire or free Palestine. They said "Death to Israel," which is a sheer expression of hatred and murderous intent. Later, I would learn from the Emory custodial staff that the damage was so extreme that the blocks of cement literally had to be pried out of the building and destroyed. And in front of my eyes, these 3 girls were posing with the Emory University of Genocide sign for their graduation pictures, giving thumbs up to the camera, laughing and pointing. They were glorifying and sharing the vandalism perpetrated by the mob that had taken over my campus. That is why I took the video, to capture the reprehensible behavior of the 3 students who glorified this illegal destruction of property and the anti-Semitic sentiment that it conveyed. It had nothing to do with the hijabs they wore and everything to do with the offensive ideas they celebrated. However, because they were wearing hijabs, I was told that I was a, quote, Muslim-hating racist, and my picture was plastered all over social media with this very phrase. I received many messages that day, some in English and some in Arabic, all telling me to get the F out of Emory, some telling me to kill myself. One girl circulated a video of pictures she had taken of me on the street and described how I was a, quote, genocide-loving Islamophobic terrorist. I also received a text from the head of Emory Open Expression at 1:30 in the morning telling me that these were, quote, nice girls, and they, quote, didn't mean anything, so could I please delete the video? This story is reflective of 2 things. First, the way that Jews, especially on college campuses, no longer have the right to call out reprehensible, illegal, or anti-Semitic behavior. When we articulate the pain and mistreatment we have experienced since October 7th, it is conflated with the racist sentiments of white supremacist organizations instead of recognized as the blatant and legitimate discrimination that it is. Let me phrase this in another way. Because I am considered part of the white privilege structure, people think I cannot make claims to anti-Semitism. Organizations like SJP capitalize on this sentiment to delegitimize our claims. When students like me scream out in pain when death to Israel is spray painted across our library, when SJP protesters scream, terrorist baby killer, at me as I walk to Chabad, the response is, you just hate all Muslims. We are the only minority group that does not get to decide what is offensive to us, and we are reprimanded for trying to do so. And it is people on both ends of the political spectrum that are perpetuating this kind of treatment. We don't know when we see a swastika or the K word spray painted somewhere, if it is from a far-right group celebrating Nazis or a far-left group accusing us of being them. The irony is that this is not about politics. It is about the widespread belief that Jews don't have the right to feel offended, to be angry, and to call out anti-Semitism when we see it. The second piece is that retaliation students face when they call out inappropriate behavior is out of control. Students on and off college campuses are employing hate speech under the guise of the Free Palestine movement. I hope you will all recognize the irony of the country's most politically correct generation adopting hate speech to refute valid criticisms of their behavior. They avoid taking blame for their actions by turning the tables and accusing Jewish students like me of attacking their identity. Let me make this very clear. No part of your personal or religious identity can include vandalizing my school. And if it does, I oppose you not because of who you are, but what you are doing. More importantly, hate speech cannot be the form of communication employed by individuals attempting to avoid the consequences of their despicable actions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sophie, for that very powerful testimony. I'll just note, because she mentioned going to Chabad, there was another incident on Emory's campus where there was a Jewish event at a Chabad house. SJP invited people who brought guns. There were arrests made. There were assaults. And when the Emory Jewish students complained, one of the responses they got from that same office that asked Sophie to take the pictures down was that it was really insensitive of them to hold a Jewish event during Ramadan, and it was probably their fault. True story. Okay, I want to turn now across the country and introduce Ilana Perlman. Ilana is a Berkeley Unified parent who's been instrumental in the fight against anti-Semitism in her children's K-12 school district. Shortly after October 7th, Ilana organized a group of Jewish parents to track the anti-Semitic incidents that were occurring more frequently in their schools. And the Brandeis Center worked very closely with Ilana and the parents that she organized throughout the OCR complaint process. Ilana is very well known in the Berkeley community, due in part to her role in organizing Jewish parents and her public criticism of anti-Semitic harassment and bullying in the Berkeley schools. And unfortunately, this has made her a personal target of retaliation and harassments by parents, teachers, administrators, and other anti-Semitic organizations. She's received personal threats both in person and on social media. Ilana's son, whose story was included in our OCR complaint, has also been the public target of retaliation, making him feel unsafe and unprotected at his school. OCR opened an investigation into the Berkeley Unified School District, BUSD schools, for its hostile environment for Jewish students in retaliation. The superintendent of Berkeley was actually called to testify before the House Education and Workforce Committee, and while she was giving her testimony, the Berkeley teachers and staff staged a protest along with several anti-Israel organizations, claiming that the congressional hearing was a witch hunt and a sham and an attack on the pro-Palestinian teachers in the school. That very same day, CARE filed a retaliatory OCR complaint against Berkeley Unified for anti-Palestinian discrimination based largely on the claims made and the evidence collected by the Jewish parents in support of their complaint. By the way, the complaint was filed by Zara Billu, the CARE director who is most famous for her speech 3 years ago where she called everybody to target even polite Zionists. And you won't be surprised to know that when people called for her to be fired, her response was, well, you're Islamophobic. We are grateful that parents like Ilana have been willing to make personal sacrifices like this to fight anti-Semitism, but nobody should have to suffer like this in order to report discrimination. Ilana will tell you more about what she and her family have experienced since coming to fight anti-Semitism in her local schools, and we appreciate you being here.
Good afternoon. My name is Ilana Perlman, and I am the mother of 3 children in Berkeley Unified School District in California. After blowing the whistle in October on anti-Semitism in our K-12 schools, I watched in horror as our district not only did nothing to protect Jewish students, but worse, removed Jewish students from anti-Semitic classrooms instead of removing the perpetrators. My child was one of the students removed from class and stuck in the library without any instruction. After exhausting every avenue of diplomacy, myself, along with several other Jewish parents, filed an Office of Civil Rights complaint with Brandeis and the Anti-Defamation League against BUSD. Since filing this complaint, Jewish parents and students have experienced ongoing retaliation and vilification by BUSD and anti-Israel organizations. One of the most shocking forms of retaliation occurred on May 8th of this year. On the same day, the Committee on Education and Workforce held a hearing on confronting pervasive anti-Semitism in K-12 schools. The Council on American and Islamic Relations weaponized the civil rights complaint system by filing a bogus complaint alleging anti-Palestinian racism at BUSD. While I would never deny that Islamophobia still does exist, this complaint went line by line through our original OCR complaint on anti-Semitism, attempting to turn the very act of complaining about anti-Semitism into itself being an act of Islamophobia. Examples include Arab students being filmed without their consent during walkouts for Palestine and being falsely accused of using hateful slogans. This is in direct response to our OCR complaint, which states these same students were shouting KKK, F Israel, death to Israel, and genocidal chants such as from the river to the sea. At the previous high school Palestine walkout, Jewish students reported to their parents that there had been chants of kill the Jews. When we reported this information to BUSD, we were told there was nothing they could do without evidence. So naturally, we went to the next walkout and filmed, as once again, there were anti-Semitic chants. Contrary to CARE's false allegations, the facts here are indisputable, and the video footage is held by our attorneys in the Department of Education. Just 2 days after the congressional hearing on K-12 anti-Semitism, BUSD middle schoolers, along with BUSD staff, held yet another walkout to take a solidarity field trip to the despicable encampments at UC Berkeley. On the way, they stopped by the Jewish Community Center with their signs and hateful slogans, chanting while Jewish toddlers were in school. The preschool had to call the police. The notion that Jewish students reporting civil rights violations will be met with a retaliatory response by the perpetrators of such violations is an abuse of the process and original intent of Title VI. In addition to this retaliation, BUSD itself has also come after Jewish parents and students for reporting anti-Semitism. Soon after our OCR complaint was filed, mounting legal pressure and negative media attention forced BUSD to finally place an art teacher on leave who had created a hostile environment for Jewish and Israeli students. However, the small win was quickly eclipsed by a vicious campaign by BUSD staff to get the teacher reinstated. Within days, posters littered the hall of Berkeley High School with a giant image of Mr. N's face with the caption, "Bring Mr. N back." The principal responded by sending shout-outs via email to all students and faculty, praising Mr. N, along with those who participated in the most recent walkout for Palestine. The posters were not taken down by the school, and BUSD teachers hold these same posters at school board meetings to this day, further antagonizing Jewish students who've been traumatized by Mr. N. In addition to being antagonized, Jewish students have also experienced retaliation for reporting anti-Semitic incidents. Right after the OCR complaint was filed, a high school 11th grade student made an Instagram post highlighting an article about the OCR complaint, which named the student and called him a dumbass who was blatantly lying because he loves genocide that much. This message was then reposted by multiple other Berkeley High School students and received countless views. Although the parent notified the principal and superintendent immediately, and despite this clear violation of the district's bullying, harassment, and anti-discrimination policies, the USD refused to condemn or make a public statement about retaliatory hate speech, sending a clear message to Jewish students that disclosing such incidents will have a drastic social repercussions leading to decreased physical and emotional safety and fear of reporting anti-Semitism. Another instance that may lead to underreporting of anti-Semitic incidents occurred shortly after the OCR complaint was filed, when a group of BUSD teachers, calling themselves Berkeley Federation of Teachers for Palestine, wrote an inflammatory and divisive letter to the school board, asserting that, and I quote, "A small group of parents with ties to Israel have taken this as an opportunity to shamefully conflate the advocacy for Palestine with anti-Semitism. The ADL is known as Israel's attack dogs in the US, and we stand with our colleague, Mr. N, and all of our fellow educators who speak truth to power." This letter characterized parents who reported incidents of anti-Semitism at BUSD as extreme, racist community members and oppressors, and labeled our efforts to protect our children's civil rights as part of the Zionist playbook. They even went so far as to accuse Jewish parents of anti-Semitic tropes and conspiracy theories, accusing us of using Israeli Defense Force surveillance tactics and flying drones over classrooms. You can't make this stuff up. Over 100 teachers signed this letter, including the very school counselors that students are supposed to entrust with their most vulnerable information. One of the teachers who signed this letter had dozens of Jewish students removed from her class, and instead of showing any remorse for her biased anti-Semitic teachings, she went on to publish an article with local media accusing parents involved in the OCR complaint of lying and describing the removal of students as caving in to the McCarthyism of today. After admitting that she teaches about Israel as a settler colonialist state committing genocide, she dismissed Jewish students' experiences, stating, "If you don't like something a teacher says, you have the right to run away from that teacher and turn your head away from what is happening in Gaza. All you have to do is claim anti-Semitism." Can you imagine being a Jewish or Israeli student forced to choose between staying in an anti-Semitic environment or being publicly shamed by your teacher? BUSD's inability to condemn or take any disciplinary action towards such incidents emboldens teachers to continue their retaliatory harassment of Jewish students. Unfortunately, this harassment has spilled out of the classroom and infected our school board meetings as well. Following our complaint, school board meetings have devolved into vicious attacks on Berkeley Jewish parents by BUSD faculty members, shouting defamatory lies and anti-Semitic tropes about Jews. For example, at a March 20th, 2024 school board meeting, the crowd shouted, "BS," when I spoke about anti-Semitic bullying of my son and other students who were called kikes and dirty Jews. People laughed and jeered at me, including BUSD staff. When I returned to my seat, the person sitting in the row behind me repeatedly called me a Zionist Nazi bitch. Not only was the school board present when this happened, but I also emailed the administration about these events, and the administration failed to respond or take any discernible action to address the virulent environment. BUSD teachers and staff have also been seen rolling their eyes and making farting sounds when Jewish speakers give public comment. It's just insane. Yet BUSD has never removed these individuals from the meetings. Myself and other Jewish parents have also been doxxed by BUSD staff and parents, publicly listing my name, profession, place of work, simply for advocating for Jewish children. I've been publicly defamed, followed out of stores, and directly threatened with my kids in tow, all because I refuse to allow a school district to bully Jewish children. The environment has become so hostile toward Jews that attending school board meetings and BUSD's inaction has effectively censored Jewish voices in Berkeley, California. Despite Jews making up just 0.02% of the population in America, incidents of anti-Semitism have increased by a staggering 360% since October 7th. Further, not all victims of anti-Semitism report their experiences, which is especially true of our student victims. I would like to remind everyone we are talking about children here, as young as 4-year-old transitional kindergarten students who were subjected to anti-Semitic flyering around their Berkeley elementary school, depicting an image of a child with its face blown off, again, with zero district response. When my child, at 6 years old, saw that image, she asked me, "Mommy, is that kid sleeping? And why does it say Israel all over it?" This was last November, and I hadn't even explained the war and everything to her yet, and I had to do it. When school districts retaliate against Jewish families for reporting civil rights violations, it sends a terrifying message to the Jewish community that Jewish students don't matter and will be punished for reporting anti-Semitism. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs once stated, "The hate that begins with Jews never ends with Jews." And the dangerous precedent being set at Berkeley Unified School District in its retaliation against Jewish students for reporting anti-Semitism is ultimately a threat to the civil rights and safety of all students. Thank you.
So I'm here today to introduce the first of two American University students. And before I go into this, I want to say we go way back because I first started to work with the American University students when they went to a Linda Sarzour event, of all things, with questions prepared. And when it came time for the question and answer, they were not let back in to ask their questions. They had pretended that the event ended, they had left, and everybody else went back in, and they just, somehow, the Jewish students were the ones who weren't allowed back in to ask their really thoughtful questions. Shortly after October 7th, a number of these same students came to me and said, there's a lot of anti-Semitism on our campus, and we're really concerned. And so we started to work together, and in this process, and after hearing about all the harassment that they were enduring by SJP and pro-Palestinian students, of all things, they go and to hang up, and I will tell you this in more detail, but they found themselves faced with disciplinary charges for essentially collecting evidence to show that their posters were being vandalized and standing up for their own civil rights on top of everything else. So I'm going to introduce Naomi Hazen today to come and tell you her story first. Naomi?
Thank you for inviting me to appear before you today and giving me the opportunity to share my experience. My name is Naomi Hazen. I am a first-generation student at American University studying political science with a specialization in law and politics. I am an Israeli Persian Jew. On November 5th, 2023, I hung posters of civilian hostages taken by Hamas on October 7th to bring attention to their plight and to advocate for their release. I believed that hanging these posters and spreading awareness would bring me a measure of comfort, so participating in the Bring Them Home Now campaign was a way for me to express how challenging the war is for the Jewish community. Many of the hostages in the posters were related or personally known to our Jewish community on campus. I intentionally came with my friend to put up posters of Naama Levi, her childhood friend who is still held hostage in Gaza. Fearful of being targeted as a Jew after October 7th and hoping to avoid any confrontation with anti-Israel protesters, we hung posters late at night. Unfortunately, the word got out to anti-Israel students, and they stalked us on campus. They followed us and maliciously tore down each of our posters. While tearing down the flyers, they told us that Israelis aren't real people, and they accused us of supporting apartheid and genocide against the Palestinian people. We were aware that other Jewish and Israeli students had their hostage posters similarly defaced and turned down earlier that day. Often, when Jewish and Israeli students had complained to administrators about the defacing and removal of their posters, the administrators had claimed that there was little that could be done without direct proof. Because administration had failed to take any action in the absence of concrete evidence, we used our phones to record the public conduct of students who were ripping down our posters and disparaging Jews and Israelis. AU's poster policy states, no community member should remove or deface any poster. Yet, when the administration received these recordings demonstrating that AU students intentionally violated this rule, no action was taken against the students who vandalized the posters, violating the university's student code of conduct. Instead, the university ignored those who violated the policy and investigated the Jewish students who documented the infractions. By turning the situation on its head and treating the perpetrators as the victims, the university demonstrated that disregard for the facts, held its Jewish and Israeli students to a double standard, enforced its code of conduct in a discriminatory fashion, and retaliated against its Jewish students for attempting to engage in the legally protected activity of attempting to protect their civil rights. On November 15th, the Office of Student Accountability and Restorative Practices, OSARP, opened an investigation into 5 Jewish students based on OSARP's receipt of a video taken showing Jewish students tearing down our hostage posters. We did not publicize the video or the names or the faces of the students tearing down the posters. The videos were lawfully taken of persons acting in a public space without expectation of privacy in a state that does not require the consent of both parties to make a recording. Later, I received notice from the university requesting a meeting with me. They claimed that they were simply gathering information. Not once did they indicate that we were subjects of an investigation. In fact, when they were questioning me, I had no idea which incidents they were referring to. It didn't cross my mind that my advocacy for the hostages in Gaza was a matter of investigation. On December 5th, 4 other students and I received emails from OSARP requesting our attendance at a disciplinary conference. This was the first time that we learned that we were being investigated for disciplinary infractions. After being stalked throughout our campus and made a complete fool of, our university is accusing us of being the harassers. These baseless accusations aimed at Jewish and Israeli students were made to completely delegitimize our cause, our struggle, and our voice on campus. It is unacceptable that we are discredited while our harassers are valued and protected. The entire process of being falsely accused of harassment and disorderly conduct has been stressful and deeply upsetting to me. The investigation and disciplinary conference letters were sent to me during finals week, And instead of having the time to study, I was left to deal with an overwhelming anxiety that I would be punished for something I did not do. We had little faith in that our administration would handle our case properly, which is why we involved the Brandeis Center. Without their counsel and repeated letters on our behalf, I am confident that this process would have ended differently. The Ozark Center went as far to contact each of our study abroad advisors to threaten our study abroad experience, something that I had been anticipating since I applied to AU. This threat by the university to deny us of our study abroad opportunities with no refund as a consequence of their meritless and retaliatory investigations is unjustifiable. It felt like an interrogation when we were brought in to view evidence. The administrator dealing with our case seemed frustrated with us from the start, and her actions were very invasive. Throughout the meeting, we were rushed and accused multiple times of not taking notes properly, and I was never given clear instructions. They made us feel like we were wasting their time. In a way, I felt like I was wasting my time because I knew they had already decided. In their eyes, we were guilty from the beginning. This investigation was an attempt from the university to intimidate and silence us. They wanted to have something against Jewish, Israeli, and Zionist students on campus. This investigation has also led me to wonder why students who vandalize Jewish and Israeli posters at AU are permitted to do so without consequence, but Jewish and Israeli students like myself are investigated for baseless charges. The unfortunate reality is that anti-Semitism is now expected from our student body on campus. But I would have never expected our administration to not only tolerate it, but to contribute as well. I am fearful of disclosing my Jewish and Israeli identity, something that I've always been proud of, because when I stand up for my community, I am only met with hate and hostility. This hostility is intensified by the administration's failure to address and protect the needs of their Jewish students adequately. My university has protected every minority group on campus except for mine. Instead, they choose to abandon their Jewish students and retaliate against us for defending ourselves. All I would like is to be able to proudly and safely be a Jew on campus, but American University's administration has made it impossible to do so. Thank you.
Next, you're going to hear from Lauren Kale, and you'll hear how American University enabled the perpetrators of anti-Semitism through the disciplinary process. You'll hear how the university had exculpatory evidence that they weren't going to look at. You'll hear how the university allowed Lauren to go on her study abroad and wait for weeks to hear if she was going to be found guilty or not, even though all other students had already received their outcomes. But Lauren alone was left to wait. So you'll hear how this process and how this university enabled anti-Semitism, how it caused Lauren beyond appropriate and beyond reasonable distress, and how Lauren thankfully is here to share her story.
Good afternoon. My name is Lauren Kale, and I'm a rising senior at American University here in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to share a little bit of my story today. As Naomi said, I have never been one to hide my Jewish identity. I choose to embrace my Judaism and lead by example. I'm often on campus, actively participating in Jewish events and educating others about Judaism in Israel. I'm the president of Chabad AU, Israel Culture Club, and Students Supporting Israel, as well as the former Jewish Heritage Chair of my sorority, Alpha Epsilon Phi. I have always lived loud and proud, but now I find myself being protective of my Judaism and carrying a sense of fear with me, especially on campus. For years, Jewish and Israeli students at AU have faced discrimination, harassment, and intimidation, but since Hamas's attack on October 7th, the anti-Semitic climate has intensified. Now, more than ever, fear follows me like a shadow. This is my new reality. Despite numerous complaints about anti-Semitism on campus, the AU administration has failed to take action. instead of promptly addressing these blatant acts of hatred and taking steps to rectify the hostile environment as the law requires it to do, AU has ignored the discrimination and harassment that Jewish students have endured on its campus. On November 5th, 2023, I also participated in the Bring Them Home Now campaign by hanging posters of hostages taken by Hamas. My goal was to raise awareness in a peaceful manner. There were warnings of AU students being followed and harassed during the day when putting up hostage posters, so 2 other students and I went at night to avoid these types of interactions. Unfortunately, as we hung our posters, a group of anti-Israel students proudly trailed behind us and tore our posters down. Motivated by a desire to document the incident and protect myself from what I regarded as blatant acts of anti-Semitism, I recorded the encounter on my phone. The AU administration had also previously claimed that there was little they could do without direct evidence of anti-Semitism. Thus, my friends and I recorded this incident as proof. The video shows us walking towards the anti-Israel students, but staying at a distance. I respectfully asked for clarification as to why they were tearing down my posters. One student confidently responded with, quote, "Israelis aren't real people," end quote. I knew at that moment that this could no longer be a productive conversation, and I feared that the encounter would soon escalate. So I stopped engaging and we walked away. Although I never personally disseminated the video, it reached the media as well as the AU administration. And a month later, I received an email from the Office of Student Accountability and Restorative Practices, OSARP, notifying me of a disciplinary conference to which my attendance was requested. This was the first time I had learned of an investigation against me, accusing me of disorderly conduct, harassment, and physical contact with one of the students from the night of November 5th. Charges that were completely baseless. From the start, the AU administration was not only in possession of the students' videos from that evening, but also the campus video surveillance footage, which disproved their accusations. Despite this evidence, the university chose solely to investigate the Jewish students who documented the encounter, but ignored the perpetrators. By turning the situation upside down and treating the perpetrators as the victims, the university demonstrated a disregard for the facts, held its Jewish students to a double standard, and discriminated and retaliated against us, simply for standing up for civil rights. OSARP sent me repeated emails despite directives from attorneys at the Brandeis Center who were representing me that all correspondences were to be addressed to them. Additionally, many of these correspondences and meetings took place during the same time as my first semester final exams. I was required to review my extensive case files in person while simultaneously preparing for exams and packing up to leave for my semester abroad. This caused me tremendous stress and angst already during a stressful time. The harassment from OSARP and retaliation from the university continued when they threatened to expel me from my study abroad program as a consequence of the meritless investigation against me. This threat extended to the potential forfeiture of my tuition and was used as a scare tactic to silence me. Thankfully, with the Brandeis Center's help, I was found not responsible, and the charges against me were eventually dropped. The university's inaction against anti-Semitism sends a message to the Jewish community that there are no consequences for harassing Jewish students. This only emboldens hostile individuals and further marginalizes us. I firmly believe that Jewish students deserve the same opportunities as others. More regulation is needed for these campus hearings. The process is often unfair, inequitable, and discriminatory. Eliminating anti-Semitism on campuses must start with universities ceasing to wrongfully discipline Jewish students when the evidence contradicts the charges, and by holding the perpetrators accountable for their actions. My hope is that all students, whether Jewish or not, receive equal treatment. We all deserve to feel safe, valued, and respected on campus. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the students and parent for speaking today. When you listen to these stories, you really have three important takeaways. Number one is just how terrible is what's going on out there and how unfair it is and how poorly we're being treated. I mean, when I saw Alana brought nearly to tears, it moved me as well. Just the story of how unfair and unfortunate it is what's happening out there. The second thing is the poise of our students who are out there, who are not saying, I'm going to run away and go to a different school, I'm going to give up on my university education, but they're standing up for what they believe in, and they're standing up for Jewish values, and they're standing up for other Jewish students. So thank you. Let's all give them a round of applause. Really. I was very impressed with each and every one of you. And then I also have to say kudos to the Brandeis Center. When you talk about how the Brandeis Center would step in and protect me, the Brandeis Center would say to my harassers, you can't contact me directly, you have to go through the Brandeis Center. So kudos to the Brandeis Center and their terrific staff attorneys for all the good work they do, and I think that's really impressive. Now we happen to be fortunate to have the president of the Brandeis Center here, Eliza Lewin, who is a friend of mine for multiple decades and a terrific attorney, and she is dedicating her career to protecting people who are subjected to anti-Semitic harassment. So I'm going to have her come up, and then we're going to take some questions.
Thank you, Tevi. And I really want to thank, Sophie, Ilana, Naomi, and Lauren for your strength, for your courage. You're remarkable, all of you. You have, as Tevi said, not backed down. You have stood up with confidence and with pride, and we're in awe. It's not easy, and it's so important what you have been doing. What you've heard today, I have to tell you, as president of the Brandeis Center, I talk also, not only to students each day, but I talk to the individuals who are working with other organizations also trying to help defend and protect Jewish students on campus and beyond. And I will tell you, in the last half a year, there has been a dramatic rise in these retaliatory complaints. We are seeing them all over. And that says to me and to the other organizations, these are not one-offs. This is part of a concerted strategy. This is part of an effort to intimidate, to chill, and to silence the members of the Jewish community. Because it's not only targeting us and saying, you can't bring your claims of discrimination and harassment, but you have to understand what that means. What that means is when a Jewish student feels that they are being targeted on the basis of their identity, and we have to understand what Jewish identity is, right? Jewish identity is not just defined by faith. Jewish identity, the Jews, are part of a people, and we're part of a people who have a long ancestral history and heritage that is inextricably rooted in the land of Israel. And today, if you say, I define my Jewish identity as part of a people who have an ancestral connection rooted in Israel, you are treated as a pariah. You are a persona non grata. You are a quote-unquote Zionist. And that means that you must be evil. There's been an effort on campuses today and beyond to equate any Jew who defines their identity as part of a people with ancestral connection to Israel as evil. And so when our students turn around and say, we're documenting the hatred that's targeting us on the basis of our Jewish identity, and it is wrong, it is harassment, it is discrimination, it is creating for us an environment on campus where we cannot fully engage with our full identities, They have every right to bring those complaints. And what we're seeing now is an effort to try and prevent that, to try and silence and prevent those Jews from filing those complaints and from standing up proudly as Jews. That's unacceptable. That is absolutely unacceptable, and it must stop. So, again, I commend you all for your strength, and I thank all of you who came to hear these stories. It's important that the stories be heard, and it's important that we now collectively try and make sure that these retaliatory complaints don't happen. And if they are brought, that universities or the Office for Civil Rights immediately and promptly dismiss them for the campaign of intimidation and harassment that they are. Thank you.
Thank you, Eliza, for those powerful words and for all the good work that you and the Brandeis Center do. I'd now like to open it up to Q&A. This being a Jewish organization, there are rules for the Q&A. Number one is please direct your questions to the excellent Brandeis staff attorneys who are here today and not to the students and parents. Number two, please make sure that it is a question so that it ends with a question mark. And then third, please politely listen to the answer once you have posed the question. Do we have a mic that goes around? Or Emma? All right, just stand up and say your question loud, and if people don't hear it, I will repeat it for the recording purposes. Any questions? Yes?
Thank you very much. So I'm a Jewish contact. I go to Catholic school. But I have seen it increasing in other college campuses, in general, here in DC, everywhere and stuff. So I'm not Jewish, but what can I do, like as a Catholic, what can I do to sort of combat that anti-Semitism?
Okay, I'm going to repeat the question so that, again, for recording purposes, thank you, first of all, for being here and for what you said. Our Catholic friend here, what's your name? Nathan said that he is Catholic, he goes to a Catholic school, so there's not Jews there, and he doesn't experience the anti-Semitism at his school, but he sees it. He sees it in the air, he sees it in the environment, he sees it around DC, and it's a terrible thing, and he wants to help. And he is asking today to the Brandeis Center attorneys, and I leave it to any one of you, what he can do to help. And so, who wants to take first crack? Elise.
So first, thank you. And I would say, number one, if you see the anti-Semitism, also have the strength to call it out. And two, try and make sure that it's safe for Jews to express their identity. Right? If you see that effort to somehow squelch that, to somehow deny in certain spaces Jews to be welcome with their full identity, if you have the courage and the confidence to call that out, that would be enormous.
Anyone else? All right, next question. Yes, right. And please say your name first.
Hi, I'm Jonathan. And so one question I think would be incredibly useful is to ask, what obligations do universities or school districts or other institutions have when they're faced with a complaint that is intentionally retaliatory?
So Jonathan's question is what obligations do institutions have when they're faced with a retaliatory complaint? I think this is one for Rabbi Mark.
Sure. Let me sharpen the question a little bit, if I can, which is how do you tell the difference between a retaliatory complaint and a complaint that is actually not retaliatory? And the answer is this is actually a solved problem in most areas of law. So you don't normally have these kinds of hearings or other forms of discrimination, which tells you that there are usually these kinds of screening principles in place that can solve for that. So for example, common sense, timing, and initial screening procedures usually will filter out or should filter out retaliatory complaints. We just heard from Naomi and Laura about that there was actual video evidence discrediting those claims. Right? Usually university procedures require that there be some initial investigation unless the complaint is frivolous. So the word frivolous has to mean something. It has to be the kind of retaliatory complaint that can easily be screened out using common sense, timing, and the same screening principles that are used in every other area of law. So they should do an initial look. If it's frivolous, they should throw it out.
Thank you, Jonathan, for the question, and Mark for the answer. Next. Yes, in the back.
So, Josh, I was thinking with respect to all of us, is the current OCR Title VI complaint process sufficient for asserting between frivolous and retaliatory complaints through open complaints and adjudicating your own complaints in a manner that holds justice on the part of civil rights law for your students? And is the issue one of having the correct definition in place? I want clarity in terms of exactly what definition of anti-Semitism using in this instance. What would make the system more effective, or if the system is sufficiently effective in access?
Well, thank you for that question, Josh. I'm going to ask Ben to answer the question, and let me just say what it was. It was Josh is a congressional staffer, and he wants to know, is the current process sufficient for sorting out complaints and adjudicating them in a way that brings about justice? Ben?
To start with the last part of the question, what's the definition that the Department of Education uses? They've been using the same definition for almost a decade now, for some unexplainable reason. Colleges and universities haven't adopted this definition, even though the Department of Education is, and they receive funding from the Department of Education. The definition is the only definition recognized by governments across the world, and it is the IHRA definition, IHRA, National Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, which gives contemporary examples that are extremely useful. It spells out what is anti-Semitism and shows you what it is. Now, what about OCR, the first part of the question? OCR is very capable of enforcing resolution agreements, which require schools to take concrete actions moving forward. Now, sometimes these resolution agreements can take upwards of a year, 2 years to come out, beginning with the filing of a complaint. And sometimes we'll see students graduating. So how do those individual students get relief then, if the timing is so long? So something that could be done is helping those students in the immediate now, while continuing to see what systemic changes need to be made.
Just adding to that. So one is, for example, with the BUSD complaint that was filed with OCR. It's one thing when you have members of communities. So for example, if there are students who are having their hijab ripped off, or who are experiencing discrimination on the basis of their Arab or Muslim identities, that needs to be addressed by OCR. However, what was very problematic about what OCR did in opening the investigation there is that it's as if they went through the complaint that was filed on behalf of the Jewish students and took those elements that were examples of hostility towards Jews and flipped the attempt to raise awareness, to complain about that hostility, to document that hostility, and turn those efforts into an allegation of harassment against Muslim students. That's merely an effort to demonize Jews for expressing pride in their identity and demanding equal treatment, demanding protection, and the ability to express their identity. So OCR does need to be very careful. Sometimes I think that there's a sense that they have to make sure that they're combating anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. That's all one word, right? You can't. You have to be able to combat anti-Semitism and anti-Semitism. You need to be able to look at your discrimination against Arabs and Muslims separately. You don't always have to link and tie them together, and you certainly need to be careful not to be taking the effort to protect Jews, and when the Jews complain about the discrimination on the basis of their identity, and invert that into a claim of harassment against Muslims when it's not. The other thing that I just wanted to say about the IHRA definition, and one of the reasons why it's so crucially important, is that one of the biggest challenges we have today on campus is that the administrators still can't tell the difference between what is a good faith political debate and what is the dehumanizing of Jews. And the IHRA definition is the definition that is designed specifically to help understand that distinction. So what the IHRA definition does, And I always advise people to go back and take a look at the 2010 definition that the State Department adopted. The IRA definition was issued 6 years later in 2016. But you can still on the State Department website, this is 2010, the Obama administration, first time the government adopted the definition of anti-Semitism. It is, for all intents and purposes, identical to the IRA definition. The main difference is that the 2010 definition pulls out the examples relative to Israel, puts it on the second page with a big heading that says, what is anti-Semitism relative to Israel? And then it divides those examples into 3 categories: demonization, double standard, and delegitimization. So first of all, if you read the examples under those headings, you'll understand that what the definition of anti-Semitism is trying to do is say, you can criticize the government of Israel, you can criticize the policies. What you can't do is dehumanize Jews. You cannot, right, once the criticism of the government of Israel crosses the line, it crosses the line where what you're doing is not targeting policies, but what you're doing is treating Israel as the collective Jew. So what you're doing is either demonizing, right, those traditional anti-Semitic stereotypes of the Jews greedy and bloodthirsty and conniving and controlling, but instead of being an individual Jew, it's Israel as the collective Jew. Right? The idea of double standards, you're now applying you're treating Jews differently, you're treating Israel differently, holding it to a higher standard than any other country in the world. And demonization and delegitimization. Delegitimization is defined as denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination. Now, if you think about that, what gives the Jews their right to self-determination? What gives the Jews their right to self-determination is the fact that we are a people, not just a faith. And what gives us the right to self-determination, specifically in some borders of the land of Israel, is that we have an ancestral connection to that land. The Jewish people are indigenous to Judea. So if you're going to deny the Jewish people their right to self-determination, what you are actually doing is denying that the Jews are a people with an ancestral connection to Israel. That's today's common manifestation of anti-Semitism, and yet most people today still don't understand that as anti-Semitism.
We have a question over here.
Yeah, my name's Joe.
So Joe asks if there are any gaps in legislation or new legislative initiatives that could help address this terrible problem of anti-Semitism. Deena, do you want to first crack?
Sure. I would. Oh, sorry. Yes, I would say that the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, which I know is out of committee but hasn't been put to the floor, would actually address, the problems with anti-Semitism. I think I should let Lisa speak more about it because I know you're much more familiar with the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act than I am. I don't want to.
That's true. The Anti-Semitism Awareness Act would basically codify the executive order. The executive order requires the Department of Education, when it's reviewing these complaints that allege anti-Semitic harassment and discrimination, to utilize the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. And that would be one very significant step in terms of helping address this problem.
Thanks. Mark also wants to address this.
Sure. In addition to the Anti-Semitic Awareness Act, which codifies the IRA definition for Title VI, there's pending legislation, the Define to Defeat Act, which does the same thing across all federal anti-discrimination laws. It just makes common sense. If it's the right definition of anti-Semitism, it should be applied equally, for example, in the employment context as well as the educational context. There's also new legislation, the University Accountability Act, which directly deals with some of the issues mentioned in the previous question regarding OCR and Title VI. I'm unaware of any instance, for example, in which a university actually lost its funding because of the hostile environment that it allowed to fester. And OCR is sometimes very lenient in allowing these settlement agreements and sort of kicking the ball down the road and saying, well, try a little harder next time. What the University Accountability Act would do would allow Congress to impose fines through the executive department to make sure that there was an actual penalty that would cause perhaps more of a immediate deterrent effect.
I think I saw a question in front of Josh. Yes, yeah. Yes, you're in front of Josh.
First of all, thank you for your question related to your comment. When you see
Well, first let me say thank you to Mr. Ravina for raising such an impressive daughter and a brave daughter. So good for you. His question is, when we see these complaints being mishandled as they are, and it might be intentional, it probably is intentional, what's the next step? What do we do? How do we address this problem?
I'd be happy to.
Deena will take this one.
So when a lot of times I'll meet with students and they'll tell me that something has gone down at their university, and I said to them, have you put anybody on notice? Have you, filed something to let them know that this incident went down? And when the answer is yes, we have filed all these reports, we put administrators on notice, or a lot of times I have students like your daughter who have gone right to the president or to the deans or the people who make the decisions, and they'll get a meeting with them and they'll tell them stuff and then nothing changes. So that comes to our attention very quickly. Sometimes, in the past, prior to October 7th, we used to write a lot of letters, to sort of tell universities that, we were on notice and that we would probably be filing an OCR complaint. There really isn't time so much these days, and a lot of times we do file OCR complaints rather quickly, on that regard, so that somebody else is brought in. And as you can also see, there are now lawsuits being brought to also hold universities accountable when they are not doing right by Jewish students. I don't know if anybody wants that.
The only thing that I would really add to that, though, is that our first concern, especially when it's retaliation, is to try and protect the student. So the first thing that we do is try to make sure that whatever process is happening, they're defended, that we have counsel. We are seeing that for these proceedings, there are often students who hope they may not actually be represented by counsel. So we work to be the support person, or trying to make sure that whatever they are permitted, we give them the most support that they can get. That's number one, is to try and get them through that process, and afterwards we can bring, as Deena is saying, with the American University students, we work with them both in terms of the actual disciplinary system, but it also became part of our OCR complaint because this was our retaliation claim.
Great. Other questions? Yes, in the back corner.
I'd like to take this one.
Okay. So
Okay.
Paige asked about the University of Pennsylvania, and Deena has some expertise there, but she asked specifically about the issue, which is an issue at many campuses, of non-students who are engaged in this anti-Semitic, anti-American, pro-Hamas harassment and attacks. And what are the university's obligations at dealing with this, at protecting Jewish students on these campuses, and making sure that these people who don't belong on campus aren't engaged in this kind of very problematic activity?
So this obviously did come up at Penn, and as an alum, there's Locust Walk, which is a public walkway, right? So Penn doesn't regulate it, but there is property that's owned by Penn, and they can decide who gets in and out, and they also have time, place, manner restrictions for protests. And we brought this to their attention because after the Palestine Rights Festival that occurred sort of in between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, it seemed that Penn became an epicenter for anti-Semites in the general Philadelphia area to come on campus and protest, as we saw at these really large protests. And they did have a responsibility. And even not even just speaking about Penn, because I see this at other schools. Schools have rules about masking, about who they let on into their buildings. I mean, I had one university where if you're going to bring outsiders into buildings or events, they actually have to be vetted. They have to, get ID. And they have a responsibility to enforce these rules, and to see who's coming on their campus, and to make sure that their students are safe. So if the university is doing that, and I know in the case of Penn, somebody was actually assaulted by somebody who was a non-student, they do have a responsibility.
Yeah, and universities can enforce this. I teach classes at Yeshiva University. You need an ID, and you need to check that ID at the door to get into any building. I can't even bring someone off campus who's not a student or faculty in to join for a minyan if it's on the YU campus. So students have the ability to control this. Administrators have the ability to control this if they so choose. Others.
Title VI of the Civil Rights Act doesn't say prevent hostile environments from occurring unless it's from an outside person. Right? Title VI requires universities to prevent a hostile environment from developing, from fostering, and continuing to exist on their campus. Period.
Yes.
So you mentioned that Locust Walk. So that property is not owned responsibility. But I understand you can't bring someone into a building that might be owned by the person. The lots.
So Locust Walk is
I
a
gotta repeat
public
the question.
walkway.
Sure.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Joanne stepped up, Ms. Ravina, so we also have to give you kudos for a great daughter. And she asked about Locust Walk. So I made the example of buildings. Locust Walk is a public walkway. What are the university's rights, responsibilities, obligations with respect to a public walkway like that?
Right, so Penn has been very good about this, and they will tell you that Locust Walk, it's the city, it's a public walkway. However, the land that the buildings are situated on, so like a good example is the library, Van Pelt, where they had a really big protest outside by the button. That's Penn's property. That is not public walkway, right? So I know that after Penn's encampment was finally broken apart, they were able to put up barriers to prevent it from reoccurring on Penn's property. They couldn't block Locust Walk, but they could put around where the admissions building is, Adams Hall and by the library to make sure that it didn't reoccur. So there are things that they can do, but there has been a defense, and I know that they even raised it themselves at one point, saying, well, there's nothing we can do because Locust Walk is a public walkway. Yeah, on Locust Walk, but there are the other parts of that campus are clearly Penn's property.
I'm looking for the next question, but first I want to know, are there any more Ravinas here with questions?
I also want to add that, yes, there are challenges sometimes when you're talking about public spaces and public property. But there's no limit on the university's ability to use its own voice to condemn what is stereotypical, discriminatory, marginalizing rhetoric. Like, the universities should be much more forcefully saying, you know what's happening on our campus, whether it's our students or whether our students are being riled up by outsiders, you are turning our campus against members of our community. That is unacceptable, and it must stop. It just must stop. And universities have to start using their own words much more clearly and forcefully, even if some of the instigators who are coming onto campus, and now we see, right, the news the other day was that our national security has determined that there are representatives from government Iran who are involved in these campus events and encampments and encouraging us. So we should be speaking out much more effectively and doing what we can, like people was saying, to try to physically prevent it, but to the extent you can, at least use your voice.
Yeah, I want to highlight something that Elisa said, and then I'm going to call on Mark in a sec, but this was the U.S. government, this wasn't the Anti-Defamation League or the LDB, saying that Iran is involved in funding and supporting these anti-Israel, anti-America, pro-Hamas, pro-barbarian protests. So I think that was a really important point. It was in Jewish Insider this morning, really worth checking out that story, because it's not just these indigenous student groups saying, oh, we have a problem. It's enemies of the United States are fostering these very problematic attacks on our culture and our educational system. Mark.
I just want to add, when it comes to the public street question, I'll give you an example from a retaliatory complaint situation. It's important that universities are consistent in their approach to how they deal with those cases. So, for example, we had a case at NYU where one of our clients taped a couple of people who were taking down hostage posters that he had just got. And it was on a public street in the middle of New York City, zero expectation of privacy from a legal perspective. He was charged with Islamophobia, anti-Palestinian racism, doxing and endangering fellow students based on their protected identity. Okay, he was found guilty, he had to go through the whole appellate process just based on his having taken the video. He didn't even disseminate the video. In one of our meetings, I asked them about that. It was a public street, and they said, well, it's a public street, but it's on our collective campus giving us jurisdiction. So if universities are willing to take control of their campuses for some things, they have to be willing to take control of their campuses for all things.
Amen. Other questions? This is a priceless opportunity to ask real experts their opinions and their thoughts. So please do step up. Yes.
About the organization you see as where with these organizations of so much hate, not just institutions, but as an environment.
So Carol has asked a question about SJP, the Students for, I don't even want to say what their ridiculous name, but SJP is a very virulently anti-Israel hate group that harasses Jewish students, and also, and this is important, it doesn't just harass students, it harasses anybody who tries to point out what the perpetrators are doing, what the anti-Semites are doing, and so it goes after people who raise complaints. And Brandeis University, where you go, did make the wise decision of kicking them off campus. But the question for the group here is, I'm not sure who is best to address it, is what's the future of SJP? How are colleges going to handle it? And what should we in the Jewish community and Capitol Hill staff and at the Louis B. Brandeis Center be doing about this? Elisa.
So I'll just say that what we're seeing on campus today from National SJP is not new. And it didn't start post-October 7th. In fact, it used to be that when National SJP would host their national conferences, that they would put their goals up on their website before each conference. And in 2018, when they had a conference at UCLA, they posted their goals. And one of their goals demonized Zionism. I mean, it equated Zionism with ethnic cleansing, mass expulsion, death, and talked, though, about how they should recognize that Zionism can be destroyed. And then they went on in this goal to say that at our conference, we're not only going to talk theory, but we're actually going to come up with, this is a quote, actionable local and regional campaigns with clear targets. Actionable local and regional campaigns with clear targets. If you are demonizing Zionism and you talk about the idea to destroy Zionism and that can be broken down and dismantled, then who are your targets? Your targets are obviously the Zionists. So this has been a project that's been in the works for years to target the Zionists, to make them and equate them with evil, and create an environment on campus where they are not welcome. And it's, I think now, finally becoming evident to administrators who for years thought that this strategy, right, stating, as I said, thought that this was a political debate on campus, wasn't about Israel or Israel's politics, but was actually about demonizing, marginalizing the Jewish community on campus. So I think that as they're becoming increasingly aware of what SJP is about, they'll try to take action. And the concern, of course, is that we just ban SJP so that they regroup under another name. So the issue is that what they really have to do is address the underlying anti-Semitism, not just the group by name, the actual conduct, which is the shunning and marginalizing of Jews.
Mark.
Sure. We start off just by saying that NSJP, National Students for Justice in Palestine, is a misnomer. You can be pro-Palestinian without being anti-Semitic. And if you aren't, you're not pro-Palestinian, you're anti-Semitic. And it's important to note that at the outset. NSJP is the child of another group called AMP, which was founded in the ashes of a bunch of organizations that were shut down for providing material support to Hamas. And these talk about goals. At one of their conferences, AMP actually held a session on how to better navigate the line between advocacy and material support for terror. Fortunately, with NSJP, they missed that one. And That's why we're in another hat by wearing the National Jewish Advocacy Center with our partners and a couple of different law firms. We can actually file a federal lawsuit in Virginia accusing NSJP and its parent company of acting as the mouthpiece and the PR firm for us in these United States. Reason versus AMP, if anybody wants to check it out in the Eastern District in Virginia. And it's incredibly important to do this for some reasons that Lisa was talking about. NSJP has been around for 20 years. They've been terrorizing students on campuses. After October 7th, they ripped off the mask. But they've had a long, long time to sort of insinuate themselves into the consciousness on campuses. If you've ever been to any of these encampments, you walk towards the center, you'll notice something fascinating, which is that charitably, maybe 20% of the people in those encampments and in those protests know what river and what sea. Right? Most of them are there either for the pizza or because they have been genuinely misled into thinking that they are on the right side of history. Now, those 20% of extremists, you're not going to save them. You're going to walk across the street, you're going to form an organization under a different name, just like they did 20 years ago, just like they did 10 years ago, and they're going to rebuild. But you may actually save 80% of our future congressmen, senators, and regular citizens that are classmates of yourselves or our children. They don't have to go back and think that everybody hates them. If you can expose the fact that they didn't realize that they've actually been consorting with people who are providing material support for terror. And it will take them another 20 years to